Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm going to be reviewing the newest album from Sunn, Life Metal. Now, when it comes to drone metal and drone music in general, I wouldn't say that I'm necessarily the most well-versed person when it comes to this genre of music. Not necessarily that I don't like the genre of music, because I do like it, I just haven't spent a whole time really exploring every single nook and cranny of what the genre really has to offer. However, Sunn is one of those bands that I have listened to quite a bit of and that I do enjoy a good amount of their discography. Of course, given that they are, one of the most popular bands in this genre of music. So I was looking forward to this new record of theirs, hoping that they were going to deliver a pretty solid album overall. And after listening to this thing, I do think this is a pretty solid addition to the band's discography. This new album has 4 tracks on it, all of which are pretty lengthy, as you may expect coming from this band, given the fact that these songs tend to, drone on a bit, given the genre of music that they are a part of. And this album as a whole, despite having only 4 songs on it, is a pretty lengthy listen at over an hour in length. But despite that fact, I think that this album maintains a really good atmosphere, a really consistent feel throughout it. It's an album that whenever I put on, I just find myself getting sucked into the world that this album has created, and just not really wanting to leave until the album kind of forces me out at the end. This album is almost hypnotizing or intoxicating in a sense, just by how easy it is to get sucked up into its atmosphere and just kind of forget that you're listening to this thing, though I don't mean that in a bad way. Though despite this fact, I do like how, for the most part, all the cuts on this thing have their own distinct vibe and feel. They feel consistent, but at the same time, they don't all just sound like more of the same, which I think is a pretty good thing, especially given the genre of music that this album is a part of. The opening track to this thing, I'm going to butcher the name of it and I apologize, Between Sleipner's Breaths, probably saying that incorrectly and I apologize, but this opening track I think is a pretty great kickoff to the record. I really like the vocals that pop up on this track and how creepy and otherworldly they sound. The vocals on this track also sound really fragile, and they just create this very creepy atmosphere. It feels like this track is the soundtrack to some like creepy satanic event or something like that, with how these vocals play out here on the track. They're not really aggressive in a sense like you might expect from something that would sound somewhat evil. They're more just low-key but creepy at the same time, and I think they brought a really interesting dynamic to this track, especially when you put them over these very heavy and thick and doomy sounding droning riffs. The following track on the album, Troubled Air, is probably the heaviest out of all 4 tracks on this thing, featuring some really just heavy, thunderous drones that immediately catch your attention, especially coming off of that last track, which I feel was a bit more, as I said before, low-key, a bit creepier overall. This track is a bit more thunderous, a bit more in your face, but still very in tune with the vibe that the first track brought to the table. As I said before, this whole album feels pretty consistent throughout, despite the fact that a lot of the songs have their own interesting quirks and differences. The really lengthy closing track on this thing, which is around 25 minutes long, is another one of the more interesting cuts on this project, featuring some faster riffs by this band's standards, I guess you could say. Generally speaking, they're still really slow, they're still really doomy, they're still really just spacious, but by Sunn's standards, they are a bit speedier at times, and they do kind of stand out for that reason. Though they do only appear in certain parts of this track, however, this whole composition has a lot more going on in it than that. As I said before, it's around 25 minutes in length. There are some quieter sections to this track as well. There's some moments where these heavier, doomier, thunderous riffs will just come charging back in after some quieter moments. Overall, it's a pretty enjoyable listen. I do kind of wish that the track was maybe the slightest bit shorter than it is, because I don't think it needs to be quite 25 minutes long, but for the most part it is able to entertain for its full runtime. The third track on this thing, Aurora, is probably my least favorite on the entire album, not because it's necessarily a bad song, but because it's just a lot less standout when compared to the other 3 songs on this thing. It still maintains that very intoxicating, doomy atmosphere that the other 3 tracks have. It's definitely a nice bridge between the second and the last track on this thing, I will say that. However, there's just not a lot to this track that I think stands out when compared to the other three songs on this thing. Like I said, the first track had those really creepy vocals. The second one just had a bit more of an aggressive tone. The last one just had a whole ton packed into it. This one just feels a bit more there, I guess. Like, it's a nice track. It's pleasant to listen to. It holds up when compared to the rest of the sound of this thing. However, it's just a lot less standout overall. Not a bad track, but one I think is just okay. As far as any other complaints concerning this project goes, I will say that I'm also not the biggest fan of how abruptly a lot of these tracks end. For the most part, they just kind of stop in the middle of whatever vibe they have going on, which, given the overall feel of this record and the fact that it's one that you just find yourself getting easily sucked into and entranced by, it's really annoying to have it just kind of end abruptly when you're listening to it before transitioning into the next song. I do kind of wish that they had structured it so that the tracks maybe were able to flow together in a more cohesive manner, because the tracks themselves do sound very cohesive when it comes to the overall vibe of these songs, as I've said multiple times already. It's just that the actual transitions between them, I feel, are a bit stiff overall. I just wish that they were a bit more fluid. It's not a fatal flaw in this album or anything. It's not going to ruin your listening experience, but it was just a minor annoyance I had when listening to this thing. But overall, my listening experience with Life Metal was one that was really positive overall. I found this project to be really intoxicating. It had a really nice atmosphere to it. I easily found myself getting sucked into this thing, and like I said earlier, wasn't really wanting to leave it until the album pretty much forced me to when it finished. I liked a lot of the little bells and whistles that the band was able to tack on to certain tracks here that really helped some of them stand out. Overall, this thing is a pretty solid drone metal album overall. I know drone metal isn't necessarily the most accessible metal subgenre out there, but if it is one that you enjoy, then I think that this is an album that is worth your time for sure. If you're not really familiar with drone metal, or you don't really like drone metal, I don't think this album is necessarily a good place to start, or it's not really an album that's going to change your mind all too much. And yeah, despite that, I would say that this is a good project. Not as good as a record like Monoliths and Dimensions or anything, but still a really good project. But that's just my own personal opinion. If you happen to disagree, whether you like this album more than I did or disliked it more than I did, it's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave your own opinions in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content. Things like album reviews, track reviews, things of that sort. If you like that kind of content, make sure you subscribe. Thank you for watching once again, and stay golden.